Since Suzuki Roshi's death, I then have really as a primary practice for me taking care of people while they died. People began asking me. And I think in a lot of ways it was the most important teaching I received from him, was just being with him as he died and seeing what was possible. I'm actually working on a collection of stories about the dying or my teachers, starting with him. I know that his father was his first teacher and sent him to another teacher. And I know that he became the abbot of Rinsoen in the midst of some controversy, and when he was very young, very young. And that he was married, and his first wife and he had 2 children, and that one of the monks went mad and killed her. And I've never known anything beyond the bare bones of that particular story, or a piece of his story, his early history. But I can't, it's hard for me to imagine what that must have been like for him. He apparently had an enormous amount of energy for doing a certain amount of restoration and revitalizing of Rinsoen, which, even though it was on one hand a fairly small country temple, it was a temple that had a number of small temples under it, and so had a certain kind of importance because of that. It's in a very beautiful area at the base of a mountain called Grass Mountain. And one time when I was visiting there, we walked up to the top of the mountain. You could see Mount Fuji if it was one of those rare days when the sky was clear. And the mountain was terraced and farmed for oranges, small, what we would call mandarin oranges. And they'd be picked and put in these big baskets that would come down on cables. So sitting in Rinsoen, you'd hear the wind in these overhead cables, and it was, the first time I heard the sound, I thought I was hearing angels singing. It was kind of mysterious, also a little beautiful. And also part of the mountain is used for growing tea. So it's a very beautiful area, a little bit elevated above the plain, where on the coast there's a pretty big city, fishing city, called Yaizu. And I know that Suzuki Roshi early on was very keen on stones and wrangled this enormous stone up to this higher elevation where Rinsoen is located, and put it in the middle of what is now a big pond. Very beautiful stone. Stones are important in retrospect because, particularly after Zen Center bought Tassajara, which is in the Los Padres forest and includes a beautiful creek in an area where there is a big outcropping of granite boulders. And Suzuki Roshi was completely, passionately in love with those rocks. And there's some amazing stories about him working with different people to wrangle the rocks up out of the creek to make a garden, a pretty traditional, quite beautiful Japanese garden around his cabin. And he and one student worked on a very beautiful stone wall. And he eventually did some perfectly beautiful stonework up in the area where he picked the site for his ashes when he died. And he actually did a lot of the stonework there. And he was very gifted in working with stones, and communicated his enthusiasm for stones and working with them to the students who worked with him doing that kind of work. And there's some fairly mysterious stories about his almost superhuman energy and ability to move stones that were really big, given that he was a small and slight person. And one of the connections I had with him was his kind of almost irrational passion for stones. So when and it was the big stone that's in the pond at Rinsowen that he was apparently moving and broke the finger in one hand, the ring finger in one hand. So whenever you see pictures of him with his hands in gâchot, this one finger is bent, kind of reminder of that history, his encounter with that stone. The only other thing that I know about him from his early days is that, by his own description, he had quite a fierce temper and struggled with his temper. I remember the first time he told me that, I was quite surprised because I didn't know that side of him so much, although in trading stories among ourselves, those of us who practiced with him during the years that he was here in the United States, I began to hear more stories about evidence of his temper in his later years here. I didn't see it much, a couple of occasions maybe. What I knew about him more was his great patience and kindliness to people. I remember that he described himself as being someone who easily went to anger. And in having to work with that, developed a capacity for patience, which is classically in Buddhism the quality of mind which, if there's sufficient patience, anger doesn't arise. And I remember this discussion with him about anger as his example of how useful it is to have a weakness or to be a little sick or to have a leg that doesn't work very well, because you then pay more attention, take more care, may be much more long-lived and have a kind of strength for the long run, more than somebody who's blessed with great energy and health and a calm and sweet mind. That there can be a kind of blessing in those troublesome characteristics. He was a very complex person, and recently, maybe a few months ago, in January, we had a gathering of his main disciples. There were 18 of us who were able to be together, and we spent a day and a half telling stories of our experiences with him. And particularly the men in the group had, not all of them, but a few of them had stories about Suzuki Roshi losing his temper, getting frustrated. Phil Wilson, who was a very early student of Suzuki Roshi's and someone that Suzuki Roshi really loved, said Suzuki Roshi used to hit him with his stick, beat him. And Phil would laugh about it and say, I think he was just trying to get my attention. And I remember one Saturday morning when Zen Center was still at Sokoji on Bush Street, and it was one of those Saturday mornings when there was going to be a big peace march against the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of agonizing among some of us in the Zendo that day about should we be on our cushions or should we be out marching in this protest march. And a kind of questioning or doubting about the relationship between meditation practice and social conscience and social action. And one of the students was kind of explaining things to Suzuki Roshi, and at a certain point Suzuki Roshi leapt off the altar with his teaching stick and came to this person, started hitting him, on his shoulders, and was clearly very agitated. And it kind of took everybody's breath away because it was so sudden. And he just kept hitting this man on the shoulders, and it was clear that he was very upset and frustrated because he felt like we didn't understand clearly enough what it takes to change the world with respect to war and violence and that kind of thing. And then he calmed down and went back to his seat. And I think it was one of those situations where he had this kind of reaction about doubting the efficacy of practice and being deluded by what we might bring about, what effect there might be from going out and joining a protest march. But some of us have speculated that there was also in his strong reaction some residue from his own frustration being in Japan during the rise of militarism and during the Second World War.
Yeah,
and that was challenging and difficult for him. And the picture of certain Zen people's responses to the rise of militarism and fascism in Japan during that time it's a very mixed record and troubling. And it's not clear what public stance Suzuki Roshi took vis-a-vis all of that. But he somehow, during the American occupation, was given permission to teach, which was a little bit unusual because any priest who had been somehow involved in the whole rise of militarism during that period was not allowed to teach or practice as a teacher. So I don't know how it came to be that he was somebody who was given permission, but my sense was that Suzuki Roshi wasn't behind all of that, but I don't know how public a stance he took or was able to take. This is one of the places historically where those of us who knew him later and loved him want him to have had a certain kind of record. And, you know, I don't know. I don't know what his particular history is in terms of any kind of clear historical record. But I do know that one of the remarkable things to me was his passion, really, that he could, with our help and with the inspiration he felt from the kind of enthusiasm and energy that Americans had for Buddhist practice and for Zen practice in particular, bring about some reformation, some renewal, some renewal in the sense of reinvigorating and coming to a more authentic path of traditional Zen Buddhism in Japan. And in particular, he articulated that in terms of seeing the possibility of reforming Eiheiji Monastery, which is, you know, one of the two major training monasteries in Japan in the Soto Zen tradition. And I always kind of marveled at the grandness of his intention. And I think in some ways, in fact, he had, by virtue of the remarkable amount of interest and enthusiasm in his, you know, with his students, I think he actually did end up having quite a strong influence in Japan and on Buddhism in Japan. I don't know how much influence actually came to any real effect as far as Eiheiji Monastery is concerned, but I know a number of Japanese people who were first introduced to Zen practice here in the United States and then went back to Japan to be ordained and to practice somehow or another. And he had some sense that there was something fresh and authentic among the students who were coming to him, which he saw as vital and missing in Japan and Buddhism, in Buddhism in Japan. In terms of how all of that was for him, in terms of the condition of the Buddhist scene and Zen in particular during the Second World War, that I don't know. He learned English at a rather young age and had this idea of coming to the United States from the time he was fairly young. And there was a kind of vividness and strength in his intention to come to the United States, no matter what the obstacles were, that I'd love to understand more deeply, but I don't. I just know that that was true about him. I think most of the stories I heard about his relationship with Miss Ransom really began to surface after Peter Schneider started doing a series of interviews about Buddhism in the United States, and interviewed Suzuki Roshi about his own history and coming to the United States. And it was in that context that I first started hearing stories about his relationship with her. They were clearly very close, but there was also some heat in their connection. One of the stories I heard many times was about how she would put her shoes in the little alcove that was supposed to be an altar, and how Suzuki Roshi would, take the shoes away and offer incense and clean the space and have a little altar set up with flowers, and it was continually, finding the shoes there and taking them away. And they had some tussles that were like that. And I think that the connection was apparently quite mutual. I actually had driven to Tassajara to drive Suzuki Roshi and his wife, whom we all called Oka-san, back to San Francisco, and we, on the way back, went to Pacific Grove to have lunch. Surprising to me because it was sometime in the late 60s, and when I close my eyes, I can see exactly the table and where we sat and the quality of light. It was one of those times that has stayed in my memory very clearly. So we had lunch, beautiful sunny day, looking out over the Pacific Ocean. And somehow the subject came up about practice and being a parent, which was, of course, for me a very important topic as a mother of young children, single parent, and working. And I don't remember how we got into it, but at some point Mrs. Suzuki said with quite a firm voice and no hesitancy that she thought that Suzuki Roshi was a very fine teacher and took wonderful care of his students, and that he was not a good father and was not a good husband. And he very readily agreed with her. He said, "That's right. My energy and attention is really primarily with my students and with our practice together." And he so matter-of-factly accepted that description. At the same time, I felt some, maybe some sadness about having not been as good a father as he might have been. But he was pretty unapologetic. At the same time, he was unapologetic because he was just talking about what his priorities were. Now, I think one of the details about his relationship with Mrs. Suzuki that we have to keep in mind is that she was his second wife, and that they married because the kind of officialdom of Soto Zen wouldn't let him come to the United States unless he was married. And so it was, in a certain way, an arranged marriage, although they had known each other because Mrs. Suzuki had been the principal of the elementary school, or maybe kindergarten, I don't remember exactly, for a number of years. They certainly knew each other, but it's not like they'd been married from the time they were young. They hadn't had children together. So there was a way in which his matter-of-factness about not being such a good husband didn't have the same kind of sting it might have had it been his first wife who was having the conversation with me. And I think in the latter years of Suzuki Roshi and his wife being here, Mrs. Suzuki actually became more his student than, in a certain way, than his wife. She certainly had all kinds of domestic responsibilities and took care of him, took care of their life together and cooked meals and did all those things. But there was some shift on her part. She began coming to the Zendo to meditate and would come to lectures, and there was just that shift in the quality of their relationship. And I certainly felt that in those last months of his life when he was very sick and she and I were together taking care of him. I felt often like she was as much taking care of him as his student as she was as his wife. Was I serious? Yeah, I was serious. I was also suffering a lot. It was a time of a lot of upheaval and difficulty in my personal life. So I'd like to think of myself as being serious. I was also much more predominantly at that point rather confused. And my sense about the liberative consequences of Zen practice really really grew as I was able to begin to practice, do different practices. I remember initially being both quite compelled for a Zazen practice and a little afraid. Not so focused or clear, but some sense of, some sense of, oh, there's a kind of frontier here. And it took me a while to be able to not just walk around my meditation cushion, but to actually sit down on it. And I think initially my sense about the effect of Zazen practice came primarily, most easily, from what I saw about the people around Suzuki Roshi who'd been practicing for a while. And I certainly had, I didn't walk away from it. I may have had some fear come up, but I felt a kind of pull, almost like a magnetic pull, and I didn't always understand exactly what that was about. I had also studied Buddhism earlier when I was an undergraduate, and so I had a certain amount of intellectual understanding about what was going on. But in the first several years, I really put any kind of intellectual consideration to one side in service of finding out more directly what meditation practice was about. But there were a number of women practitioners in the Zen Center at that time who were clearly serious, and I certainly didn't feel any difference on Suzuki Roshi's part or on Katagiri Roshi's part, who was his assistant at the time, but particularly not from Suzuki Roshi with respect to his women students versus his men students. The area of my life where I felt more tension really had to do with being a mother and having young children, and particularly after my husband and I separated, when I was a single parent, I felt much more tension around the process of juggling formal Zen practice and taking care of my children. That was challenging and difficult for me, actually for a few years. As long as the kids were really little, I didn't feel comfortable, for example, leaving them asleep in their beds to go to the meditation room. It just didn't seem safe or responsible. So there was that kind of tension between what you would do to be a so-called good or serious Zen student and what was appropriate given my responsibilities as a parent. And I felt some liability as a mother trying to practice. In retrospect, I don't think that circumstance was a liability at all. What happened was that I had to find ways to practice by myself in our apartment together in the circumstances of being a mother and taking care of my children. That's interesting. I don't think of myself as revitalizing ritual as much as coming to appreciate the forms of ritual, which are certainly rich and present in Zen practice, but to understand how to use those forms in ways that resonate with the life I actually have. One of the first encounters that I ever had with ritual in the way that I'm suggesting came about when I went one time to talk to Suzuki Roshi about a friend of mine who had been a very close friend when I was at Stanford, and who had then at some point gone off to kind of find himself and travel around the world, and had left all of his treasures with me. He was a very gifted person and had a lot of drawings and music and manuscripts and musical instruments and all kinds of stuff, a big trunk. And after a couple of years, I lost track of my friend, his nickname was Scotty. And I subsequently found out what had happened to him when he was in a big train crash in Japan, and a week or so after the crash died as a result of his injuries. And it was only then that I discovered that he had ended up as a monk at Eiheiji Monastery. And he was going to take care of something having to do with his passport, which is why he was on the train. So when I got word of his death, I felt a lot of grief and loss. And I also didn't know what am I going to do with all this stuff that I've been taking care of all these years. So I went to Suzuki Roshi, and he said, we should do a funeral. So somebody sent me a small stone, a figure of Jizo Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of the underworld and the emanation of compassion that's called upon in Japan for protecting beings as they're traveling into life and traveling out of life. And Suzuki Roshi had me bring the figure in the trunk to Tassajara, and we made a big fire ring in the garden he was making near his cabin. And we did basically a traditional funeral ceremony for my friend, and then we burned everything that couldn't be somehow used by someone. That began a whole relationship with Jizo and with the various forms for attending or marking dying, and has had an enormous influence in my life ever since. I've ended up doing some version of that ceremony with other people now for a number of years. So, that's an example of taking having some entry or some sense of accessibility with a fairly traditional, quite traditional ceremony, but understanding how to use it in the context of the world that we live in. So these days I do that ceremony mostly around the dying of unborn children through miscarriage and abortion and sudden infant death syndrome babies. And I know out of my own experience, but also in working with people, we don't, in this culture, have such a vivid or readily familiar sense about how ritual and ceremony can actually hold us during those times in our lives when we want some holding and some marking or acknowledgement of what's so. Well, I didn't really realize how deeply that experience had dropped in for me until some years later, when people started coming to me and saying, I've had an abortion and I'm suffering a lot as a result of it, and do you have any suggestions, and is there a practice I could do? And it was really, I later realized, I'm pulling on the experience I had under a similar circumstance years ago with Suzuki Roshi. The figure is actually right there on the altar. There's a small stone figure there. That's Jizo Bodhisattva. Jizo is much loved and related to in Japan, particularly since the end of the Second World War, when abortions became legal and became the standard means of birth control. But what's interesting to me is that Americans can see an image of one sort or another of Jizo, and people pretty readily understand what he represents. There's something about the quality of the artistic expression that communicates this quality of nurturing and compassionate, protective energy. Well, it's not about forgiveness, it's about transformation.
Right.
And it's a classical practice from Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, I know that.
And it's a little, how can I relate that to Suzuki Roshi? I don't know that I can. It's complicated because, you know, the Soto Zen tradition has an enormous amount of Tantra in it. And most Zen people don't know that and get a little defensive and alarmed when they hear that. But it's largely because they don't know much about Tantric Buddhism and so don't recognize the elements. And I myself would not have seen the evidence of Tantra in Soto Zen had I not studied with Tara Tulku. And it was after studying with him for a few years that I then went to Sojiji and Eheji, especially at Sojiji, where Keizan has had much more influence. Eheji is has much more the mark of Dogen. And I remember walking into the Buddha Hall one day and thinking, gosh, a Tantric Lama would feel right at home here. You see the elements much more in ritual and ceremony. But also, you know, in Tantric Buddhism, there's this whole cluster of practices known as deity practice, where the practitioner generates oneself as the deity. And we're doing the same thing when we sit down on our cushions to practice Zazen. We're generating ourselves as Buddha. Well, it's an idea that's very articulated and worked out in Tantra, but it's essentially that's what that whole idea of, you know, when you are practicing Zazen, you are Buddha. Well, there's a whole tradition behind that, the notion of our having the capacity to do that, to generate ourselves as Buddha, or generate ourselves as Buddha in the healing mode, or generate ourselves as the Bodhisattva of purification or of compassion, the various emanations of compassion. So the inner offering practice, which is that practice with the skull bowl at the heart with the Vajra chopper, really comes out of that very articulated stream that's about the possibility of transforming literally anything into nectar sufficient for offerings of gratitude. You know, throughout Buddhism, and this is certainly true in Zen as much as in any of the schools of Buddhism, the focus on impermanence is a very major focus. There's a focus on impermanent, the mark of impermanence, the mark of unsatisfactoriness, and the mark of emptiness of inherent self-existence. And the first mark is the one that most people keep running up against, because at some point we hit some aspect of the fact of impermanence where fear arises. And what do we do then? And so much of practice is about preparing ourselves for our own encounter with impermanence, which is called dying. And, it's very central. And when we take on attending to how we react or respond to the fact of our own dying or the dying of those that we love or a situation we love or whatever, that's where we have this occasion for liberation. And it's all there implicitly in Zen. You get it much more explicitly laid out in some other schools. But all the elements are there in Zen. And for me, having access to some mapping from other traditions has helped me see, oh, this is all here in the Zen school, which I'm very grateful for. And at the same time, what I've had to come to accept is that I have different acculturation, and that what is effective in the Japanese context was not so effective for me as an American until I had learned enough to be able to get what was being expressed or demonstrated or communicated in nonverbal and more experiential terms. So in a lot of ways, I understand much more about Suzuki Roshi's teachings now than I did when he was still alive. I mean, that's part of that, in that terms of that question you were asking me about how do I relate to him now. A lot of it is really having the cultivation and maturity to understand more of his teaching now than I did when he was still alive. And I'm very grateful that I have the possibility of, it's not too late, as he said in his wonderful little pointer, do not say too late.
Say that again.
Oh, I have this piece of paper that he wrote out, do not say too late. It's a wonderful teaching, wonderful pointer. It's really about patience and not giving up on ourselves too soon. Letting ourselves take as long as we need to be ready to understand something or know something. And I look at that little message literally every day. It's been a very big help. So, I take him at his word and hope that my coming back to his teachings so much later after his actual embodied life is still soon enough. My mother passed away exactly 4 weeks ago. Today's the 24th? Yesterday. 4 weeks ago yesterday. And this actually relates to Suzuki Roshi. My husband and I were in Yosemite at the time. She got sick with what quickly within a few hours, turned to pneumonia on a Saturday morning. And she died at 2 in the morning on Monday. So she got sick and died very quickly. And my daughter did something she's never done before. She said, I think I should check Yvonne's answering machine, which she knew how to access, but had never done that before. She said, I just think I should check. That was must have been on Sunday morning. And there was an urgent message from the convalescent home. They'd somehow misplaced her phone number. Urgent message that my mother was very sick and that I should know that. So she went immediately over and was with my mother until she died and sat with her body afterwards. This is the second generation of all this. So she didn't want to leave a message at the hotel where we were staying. She didn't want to alarm me, so she kept calling. She didn't get me until Sunday evening. And by that time it was clear my mother wasn't going to live very much longer. So I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed in the dark room, and our room looked out onto Yosemite Falls. And as I was doing practices on behalf of my mother and thinking about her life and about our relationship and all of that, there was this continual roar of the waterfalls and of frogs in the meadow right at the base of the window. And in the morning, I realized that Suzuki Roshi in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind talks about his visit to Yosemite, and in particular about the falls. And that whole teaching came back to me, and I thought, how wonderful. It was like having some circle close. And what was particularly striking for me was how I felt very held by the sound, the roar of the water falling through the night. And in feeling held, I felt like I could hold my mother's consciousness as she was slipping away. And she's someone who lived virtually her entire life with enormous fear. And my worst fear for her was that she would die in fear. And she didn't. She died very calmly and very quietly, for which I'm very grateful. And you know, for all of the experience I've had sitting with people as they're dying, when one's mother passes, there's nothing else quite like it. I feel quite stopped, actually. So I'm doing practices for 49 days, and I'm trying to figure out how to do some version of what used to be the practice in China, which is that when a parent dies, you don't live in the ordinary world quite the same way for a period of a year. I think there's something right about that. Have some extended period of time for just being with this passing. You know, my vet saved a wild coyote who was up on Point Reyes from being killed by the ranchers up there. And part of the agreement was that he would build a big pen and keep the coyote confined on his property up in Bolinas, and which he did. What he didn't tell anybody was that he and the coyote, after a couple of years, would go out running together at night. He got the coyote when he was about 3 or 4, and the coyote got sick with probably some cancer about 2 months ago, maybe. And Ray called me one night and just sobbing. He said, "Cody is dying. Other than my parents, I think he's the most important being in my life." The coyote by then was 17. So I gave him some practices to do, and I said, if you want, I'll come and we'll do a funeral for him. So as soon as the coyote died, he told me, and I went up and we dug the grave site and did a funeral for him. And just as we buried him, it was an incredibly beautiful animal, even though he was that old. And just as we buried him, a coyote up on the ridge started to howl. You know, I think there's a way when an animal, especially an animal we've lived with for some time, is passing, there's a part of us that says, oh, how silly for this to be affecting me, or we discount our experience. But, you know, they're beings just like we are, and we're connected with them, and they with us. So their passing, I think, has an effect on us as much as the passing of any being that we cherish. And I think particularly with cats, because they so often want to be left alone. There's a way in which they want to crawl off, and they don't want to be held, or they don't want you to lie down next to them. They want to go find some dark closet or place under the house, and you find their disintegrated body, 3 months later or something. I think cats are particularly challenging to hang out with as they pass. And the more we attend what's actually so without interfering with what's going on, then we don't have a lot of regret after there's the passing over. But I do memorial ceremonies, and I make a little altar for 7 days or 49 days, whether it's a human being or it's an animal. I think marking those passings is extremely important. Well, a very important part of the traditional funeral ceremony is remembering the life that has been lived and acknowledging that life. Then the next step is acknowledging explicitly that there has been a dying. And then the next step is saying goodbye and allowing this kind of the hand to open, to allow dissolving and release. And if we don't do some ceremony or have some container for those steps, it's like there's this dangling. We don't allow the unencumbered passing over. And it goes on, the process of allowing that passing over goes on after the point of biological death. It's, that's why we sit with somebody's corpse for 3 days, because the subtle mind doesn't leave the body just when the heart stops or respiration stops. So interesting to me, and I've had this experience over and over again, when a number of us would be sitting with someone's corpse, and we'd all have the same experience at the same time, that, oh, now the body is empty. And we would check with each other later. Every person in the room said, oh, yeah, there was a shift then. Isn't that interesting?
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.